My name is Rosalind Okafor Bennett, Roz, to the handful of people who actually know me, and for most of my adult life, my family has operated under a single unspoken rule. My brother Marcus is the promise, and I am the cautionary tale. It wasn't always this stark. When we were kids, growing up in a modest split level outside Columbus, Ohio, my father, Daniel, treated us more or less the same, proud of both of us in the small, distracted way fathers are proud of children who haven't yet given them a reason not to be. But somewhere around my sophomore year of college, when I dropped out of Ohio State's pre-med track to pursue what my father called some kind of computer thing, the equation shifted permanently. I want to be precise about what happened, because the story my family tells about it and the story that's actually true have diverged so completely over the years that I sometimes have to remind myself which version is real. I didn't drop out because I was struggling. I dropped out because I had, almost by accident, built a small piece of inventory tracking software for the campus bookstore where I worked part-time, and the bookstore's regional manager had asked whether I could build something similar for their other 12 locations. That request turned into a contract. The contract turned into 3 more. By the end of my sophomore year, I was making more money from freelance software contracts than my father made as a mid-level insurance claims adjuster, and I made the calculation, coldly, rationally, the way I make most decisions, that finishing a pre-med degree I'd never wanted in the first place made less sense than dropping out and building the thing I was actually good at. My father did not see it as a calculation. He saw it as a betrayal of a plan he'd quietly held for me since I was 12 years old. The plan where his daughter became Dr. Okafor Bennett and hung a framed medical degree in a waiting room somewhere, and every time he introduced me to someone at church after that, there was a version of him that still seemed to be waiting for me to admit the mistake and go back. The conversation where I told him I was dropping out remains, to this day, one of the more difficult 20 minutes of my life. I drove home from campus specifically to tell him in person, rehearsing the explanation the entire 2-hour trip, the bookstore contract, the 12 locations, the math that no longer made sense to keep paying tuition for a degree I didn't want when I already had proof I could build something real. I laid it all out at the kitchen table, spreadsheets and all, the same kitchen table where he'd once helped me with algebra homework. He listened to the entire thing without interrupting, which I mistook in the moment for a good sign. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, turning his coffee mug slowly on the table, without drinking from it. "You're 20 years old," he finally said, throwing away a medical degree to build websites for a bookstore. "Do you understand how that sounds, Rosalind? Do you understand what people are going to think?" I tried to explain that it wasn't a website, that it was inventory tracking infrastructure, that the distinction mattered, but I could see, even as I spoke, that the specifics weren't really what he was reacting to. He wasn't worried about the technology. He was worried about the story he'd have to tell people at church, at work, at family gatherings, about a daughter who'd quit medicine for something he didn't understand and couldn't easily explain to anyone else. Marcus, meanwhile, did exactly what was expected of him. He finished his business degree on time. He got a steady job at a regional bank. He met a woman named Kayla in his second year out of college, a kind, conventionally accomplished woman with a marketing job and an Instagram full of tastefully filtered brunches, and my parents adored her immediately and completely, the way you adore anything that confirms you made the right choices raising your children. I don't resent Marcus. I want to say that clearly because this isn't a story about sibling rivalry in the way people usually mean it. Marcus never told me to my face that I'd embarrass the family. Marcus, in fact, barely spoke to me about my career at all in either direction, not out of malice, just out of a kind of incuriosity that I eventually understood was its own quiet message. My existence, in his life, was more logistical than emotional, a name on the family group chat, a person who occasionally showed up to Thanksgiving in clothes that didn't quite match the family's aesthetic, a mild embarrassment he'd learned to manage rather than a sister he'd learned to know. The company I built, Ledgerline, an accounting automation platform for small businesses, grew slowly, and then suddenly, the way most real things grow. For the first 4 years, it was just me and a laptop and a level of financial precarity that I never once mentioned to my family, because mentioning it would have confirmed every fear my father already had about my decision. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. I drove a car with 140,000 miles on it that made a concerning sound whenever I braked below 30 miles an hour. I wore the same 4 sweaters in rotation for 2 winters because buying new clothes felt like money I couldn't justify spending on myself when every dollar was going back into the company. My family saw exactly this version of me: the tired clothes, the unreliable car, the vague answers about the computer thing, and drew their own conclusions. They assumed, reasonably enough given what they could see, that I was struggling. What they couldn't see was the 11-person engineering team I'd hired by year 3, or the $3 million Series A I'd closed at 26, or the fact that I drove the same beat-up car specifically because I'd made a rule with myself, back in the earliest days, that I would not spend on visible comfort until the company's finances were unshakable. I was, by every internal metric that mattered, wildly successful. I simply looked, from the outside, exactly like the failure my father had predicted. By the time I was 28, Ledgerline had grown to 60 employees and was processing accounting automation for over 4,000 small businesses across the country. I closed a Series B that valued the company at $80 million in the spring of that year, a number I did not share with my family, partly out of habit, and partly, I'll admit, out of something closer to spite. I had spent 6 years being quietly written off as the family disappointment, and there was a stubborn, wounded part of me that didn't want to hand them the satisfaction of being proven wrong until I was ready. That same year, a journalist from a regional business publication profiled me for a piece on Midwest tech founders who'd built companies outside the coastal hubs. The article ran with a photo of me in my actual office, modest by Silicon Valley standards, but real, with 60 desks and a wall of client logos, and got picked up more widely than I expected. It caught the attention of a Forbes editor putting together that year's 30 under 30 list for enterprise technology. I found out I'd made the list in November, 3 months before my brother's girlfriend's graduation would even become relevant to this story, and I told exactly 2 people: my co-founder, Devin, and my therapist, a woman named Dr. Aaliyah Kessler, who had spent the better part of 2 years helping me understand why my instinct, upon receiving genuinely good news, was still to keep it to myself rather than share it with the people who were supposed to celebrate it with me. "You know you're allowed to tell them," she said, during one of our sessions that winter. "I know," I told her. "I just don't know what I'm supposed to do with the version of them that finds out I'm not the disappointment anymore. I don't trust that version. I think it's worse, somehow, than the version that just quietly wrote me off." I didn't fully understand what I meant by that until months later, standing backstage at a hotel ballroom in downtown Cincinnati, waiting to walk onto a gala stage while, 3 miles away, my father sat in a folding chair at a college auditorium and watched his son's girlfriend's younger sister walk across a stage in a cap and gown, an event I had specifically, deliberately, been told not to attend. There's a version of this decision, the choice to keep the news to myself for months, even from my own parents, that I've had to sit with uncomfortably in the years since. I don't think it was entirely healthy, this instinct to hoard good news like something fragile that might be taken from me if I shared it too soon. Dr. Kessler and I spent a lot of sessions untangling where that instinct came from, and we always landed in roughly the same place. I had learned, very young, that sharing my accomplishments with my family rarely produced the response I actually wanted. Either the news was met with polite, distracted acknowledgement before the conversation pivoted back to Marcus, or, worse, it was met with a kind of skepticism dressed up as concern. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Rosalind? Are you sure you're not getting ahead of yourself?" I had, without ever consciously deciding to, stopped bringing my wins home. It was easier to keep them where they couldn't be diminished. #, inciting incident. The call came on a Tuesday, 9 days before the graduation. I remember exactly where I was, in Ledgerline's conference room, halfway through a product roadmap meeting with my engineering leads, when my phone buzzed against the table and I saw my father's name. I stepped into the hallway to take it because some old habit still made me treat calls from my parents as things requiring my full attention, regardless of what else was happening. "Hey, Dad."
Roz. Hi.
"Listen, I wanted to talk to you about Emma's graduation next Saturday." Emma was Kayla's younger sister, Marcus's girlfriend's sister, technically no relation to me at all, though our families had grown close enough over the years that her college graduation had become, somehow, a whole family event, the kind of milestone my parents treated with the gravity usually reserved for actual blood relatives. Sure, I said. What's going on? There was a pause, the kind of pause I'd learned, over the years, to recognize as the sound of my father working up to something he'd rehearsed, but still found uncomfortable to say out loud. I think it's probably best if you skip this one, he said finally. Marcus mentioned, and I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but Kayla's family is going to be there, her parents, her extended family, people Marcus hasn't really introduced you to yet. And he's a little worried about, he loves you, you know that, but he's worried about how it'll look. Kayla's already asked him a couple times why you dress the way you do, why your car's in that condition, and he doesn't really have a good answer for her. He doesn't want her family asking why his sister looks. My father hesitated, and I heard him choose the word with visible reluctance, homeless. At a formal event like this. It's not personal, Roz. It's just optics. I stood in the hallway outside my own conference room, in a building I owned the lease on, employing 60 people, having just closed a funding round that valued my company at $80 million, and listened to my father explain that my presence at a stranger's sister's graduation might embarrass my brother in front of his girlfriend's family because I looked poor. There was a version of me, an earlier version maybe from 3 or 4 years back, that might have argued. Might have said something sharp and defensive, might have tried to explain right there in the hallway exactly how wrong he was. But something in me had gone very calm instead, the particular calm that settles in when you've finally stopped expecting people to see you accurately and have started, instead, simply cataloging the gap between what they believe and what's true. Understood, I said. Roz, I really don't want you to think. I said, I understand, Dad. It's fine. I have a work thing that day anyway. This was true, though I hadn't mentioned it yet, and some part of me, small, tired, still hoping, even then, waited to see if he would ask what the work thing was.
He didn't ask.
Great, he said, with obvious relief, the relief of a man who'd expected a much harder conversation. We'll see you soon, okay? Love you. Love you too, I said and hung up and stood in the hallway for a long moment before going back into my meeting, where Devin took one look at my face and asked if everything was okay. I told him it was fine. It mostly was. #, preparation. The work thing I'd mentioned to my father was, in fact, the Forbes 30 Under 30 Regional Gala, a black tie event in downtown Cincinnati. Scheduled for the same Saturday afternoon as Emma's graduation, featuring a keynote panel of that year's Enterprise Technology honorees. I was one of 6 panelists scheduled to speak, seated on stage in front of roughly 200 attendees, including several regional business leaders, university deans invited as honored guests, and a moderate amount of local press. I hadn't planned the scheduling collision on purpose. The gala date had been set months earlier by Forbes events team, long before Emma's graduation had become, apparently, a referendum on my family's social standing. But once I realized the 2 events would happen on the same afternoon, 3 miles apart, I felt something settle into place that I didn't examine too closely at the time. I told myself it was simply convenient, that I now had a legitimate, unrefusable reason to decline an invitation I'd already been uninvited from. I spent the week before the gala the way I spent most weeks, deep in the unglamorous machinery of actually running a company, reviewing Q3 numbers with our CFO, sitting through a brutal but necessary conversation with our head of sales about a churn problem in our mid-market accounts, prepping talking points for the panel with Devin, who had become, over 6 years of building Ledgerline together, something closer to a brother to me than my actual brother had managed to be. You nervous? He asked me the night before, as we ran through potential panel questions in my office. About the panel? No, I said. About my family finding out at the same time as 200 strangers? A little. You could just tell them beforehand, he said, not for the first time. I could. I agreed and left it there, because I still didn't have a good answer for why I hadn't, beyond the stubborn, wounded part of me that wanted them to find out the way I'd spent 6 years finding out about them, sideways, unprepared, forced to reckon with information they hadn't been handed gently. The morning of the gala, I dressed carefully, a tailored charcoal blazer over a simple black dress, the kind of understated, expensive clothing that photographs well under stage lighting without looking like it's trying too hard. It was, I realized as I looked at myself in the mirror, almost exactly the opposite of the outfit my father had implicitly described on the phone a week earlier, the homeless look, the clothes that embarrassed my brother in front of Kayla's family. I hadn't dressed this way for years, mostly because I hadn't needed to. Today, for reasons that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with timing, I did. I drove to the hotel, not in the car with 140,000 miles, which I'd finally, quietly replaced 8 months earlier, but I still hadn't mentioned that to my family either, and checked in backstage, where a coordinator handed me a small microphone pack and walked me through the panel's run of show. 40 minutes until doors. 90 minutes until my segment. 3 miles away, at that exact moment, Emma was almost certainly lining up in a cap and gown, and my entire family was almost certainly filing into folding auditorium chairs, having successfully removed the one relative whose presence might have complicated their photographs. Hashtag confrontation scene. The gala's afternoon panel was titled, Building Beyond the Coasts, Founders Redefining Regional Tech, and I was seated third from the left, between a fintech founder from Indianapolis and a healthcare AI founder from Detroit. The moderator, a business journalist I'd worked with before, opened with a question about what had made me stay in Ohio to build Ledgerline rather than relocating to a coastal hub, and I answered it the way I answered most questions about my company, plainly with numbers, without performance. I don't know exactly when the recognition happened in the audience, because I wasn't looking for it. I was focused on the panel, on the questions, on the particular discipline of sounding confident about my company's trajectory without sounding like I was bragging. But I found out afterward, in painstaking detail, from my brother himself, who apparently had not been in the audience at all. He'd been sitting in the college auditorium beside Kayla, 3 miles away, exactly where he was supposed to be. What actually happened, according to the version I eventually pieced together, was this. The dean of the business school where Emma had just graduated, a man named Dr. Terrence Whitfield, who also happened to sit on the regional advisory board for the Forbes event and had, coincidentally, been given an advance program for the gala earlier that week, was seated near my family during the graduation ceremony. Somewhere during the long stretch of names being read aloud, he'd been glancing through the gala program on his phone, reviewing the panelists' bios for an event he was attending that same evening. He recognized my name. Not immediately. The program listed me as Rosalind Okafor-Bennett, founder and CEO of Ledgerline, and it took him a moment to connect it to the last name he'd heard my father mention, months earlier, at a fundraising dinner where Dr. Whitfield and my father had been seated at the same table, and my father had, in an offhand comment about his children, mentioned that his son worked at a bank and his daughter did some kind of computer thing, not sure exactly what. Dr. Whitfield leaned toward my father, according to Marcus's later, halting account of the conversation, and asked, with genuine friendliness, "Bennett, is your daughter Rosalind Okafor-Bennett by chance? I could swear I just saw her name in tonight's Forbes gala program. Founder of some accounting software company, Ledgerline, I believe. Quite an impressive bio. If it's the same person, $80 million valuation, 60 employees, 30 under 30 this year." My father, Marcus told me later, went very quiet. And then, because my father has never in his life been able to resist correcting a misunderstanding, he said something like, "No, that can't be right, my daughter. She does some freelance computer work, but nothing like that." Dr. Whitfield, apparently unbothered, pulled up the digital program on his phone and turned the screen toward my father. There it was, my name, my headshot, my bio, the 60 employees, the $80 million valuation, the 30 under 30 designation, scheduled to speak on a live panel that very afternoon, 3 miles from where they were currently sitting. It was Marcus, not my father, who first turned to look for confirmation, not from Dr. Whitfield, but from his own phone, where he pulled up the Forbes events live stream, available publicly on their website for anyone who wanted to watch the panels remotely. He found the stream. He found the panel. And there, on a small glowing screen in the middle of a graduation ceremony, was his sister, sitting under stage lights in a blazer he didn't recognize, being introduced by a national business publication as one of the most promising young founders in the country. Kayla, sitting beside him, glanced at the screen and then at Marcus's face, and asked, reasonably enough, "Wait, is that your sister? The one who couldn't come today?" Marcus, according to his own later account, did not answer her right away. He just stared at the screen, at me, mid-sentence, answering a question about scaling infrastructure for small business clients, dressed in a way that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the version of me he'd apparently described to Kayla and her family over the preceding months. The vague, slightly embarrassing sister with the unreliable car and the outdated clothes. The sister he hadn't wanted asking uncomfortable questions at a formal event. He froze, because there was no version of the explanation he'd give Kayla's family that didn't require him to admit he'd never actually known his own sister at all. Hashtag immediate consequences. I found out about all of this roughly 2 hours later, when the gala panel wrapped, and I checked my phone backstage to find 11 missed calls, 4 from my father, 3 from my mother, 2 from Marcus, 1 from Aunt Deborah, whom I hadn't spoken to in over a year, and 1, bafflingly, from a cousin I hadn't heard from since a wedding in 2019. Devin found me first, actually, before I'd even looked at my phone. He'd been watching from the audience and had seen the ripple move through the crowd near where Dr. Whitfield was seated, a small commotion of phones being pulled out and heads turning toward the graduation live stream one of the attendees had apparently pulled up out of curiosity once the story started spreading through that section of the room. "Something's happening out there," he told me as I came off stage, still slightly breathless from the panel. "People near the front were passing a phone around during your segment. I think somebody figured out who you are." The first voicemail was from my father, and I could hear, even in the recording, that his voice had a strange, unsteady quality to it, the sound of a man trying to recalibrate his entire understanding of a person in real time. "Roz, it's Dad." I just saw, Dr. Whitfield showed me something I don't understand. Is it true? Is Ledgerline, are you the founder of Call Me Back? Please call me back." I didn't call back immediately. I sat backstage, still in my blazer, microphone pack still clipped to my waistband, and let myself feel, for a long moment, the strange vertigo of finally being seen by exactly the people who decided, months earlier, that I wasn't worth being seen at all. Marcus texted while I was still deciding what to do. Roz. I had no idea. Kayla is asking me 100 questions, and I don't have any answers. Can you call me? I read it twice. There was something almost funny about it, in a bitter way. The same brother who told our father, indirectly, that I might embarrass him in front of Kayla's family was now scrambling to explain why he'd apparently known nothing at all about his own sister's actual life. I called my mother first, mostly because she'd texted rather than called, a simple message that read, "Please call when you can. We're so confused and so proud, and I don't understand why you didn't tell us. Hi, Mom. Rosalind." Her voice broke slightly on my name. "Is it true? Dr. Whitfield showed your father. We watched part of the live stream on his phone in the middle of the ceremony. I'm so embarrassed we weren't even paying attention to Emma anymore. Is that really your company? $80 million? 60 employees?" "It's true," I said. "Why didn't you tell us?" I thought about all the ways I could answer that question. The true, complicated, layered answer involving 6 years of quiet dismissal, of being handed reasons why my presence might embarrass my brother, of watching my accomplishments get filtered through my appearance rather than judged on their own merits. I settled, in the end, on the simplest version. "You told me not to come to today's event because I might make Marcus look bad," I said. "I didn't think you were especially interested in hearing about my life this week." There was a long silence on the line. "Roz, we didn't know." "I know you didn't know," I said. "That's sort of the point, Mom. You didn't know, and you still decided I wasn't worth including. You didn't need to know I ran a company to decide that excluding me was fine. You just needed to think I looked poor." Hashtag resolution/epilogue. The weeks that followed were not, I want to be clear, some kind of instant, uncomplicated repair. My father called 3 more times over the next several days, each conversation a little more honest than the last, working his way slowly toward an actual apology rather than a series of stunned, half-formed questions about my net worth. Marcus took longer, nearly a month, before he finally said the thing that mattered, which wasn't really an apology about the graduation at all, but something closer to an admission that he'd never really tried to know me, that it had been easier to let me remain a vague, slightly embarrassing footnote in his life than to ask real questions and risk finding out I was someone he should have been paying closer attention to all along. I didn't make it easy for either of them, and I don't think I owed them ease. I told my father, plainly, that I didn't need him to be proud of me because a dean happened to recognize my name in a gala program, that the pride, if it was real, needed to extend backward, to the years he'd assumed the worst about a daughter, who was quietly building something remarkable while wearing the same 4 sweaters in rotation because she was too busy actually building it to care what she looked like doing so. He heard me, eventually. Not all at once, and not perfectly. My father is not a man built for swift emotional recalibration, but over the following months, something in the texture of our relationship did genuinely shift. He started asking real questions about Ledgerline, and more importantly, he started listening to the answers instead of waiting for a pause to redirect the conversation back toward Marcus. He asked, one Sunday call in late autumn, whether he could visit the office sometime, and when he finally did, in early winter, I watched him walk the floor slowly, reading the client logos on the wall, stopping to shake hands with employees who'd never heard him mentioned by name before. He didn't say much during the tour. Near the end, standing by the window of my office, he said, quietly, almost to himself, I had no idea it looked like this. I didn't ask him to clarify what this meant. I let it sit, because I understood it well enough. Marcus and I are, if not close, at least honest with each other now, in a way we weren't before. Kayla, to her credit, reached out to me directly a few weeks after the graduation, somewhat sheepishly, to apologize for the questions she'd apparently asked about my appearance, questions I'd never actually heard directly, only through my father's careful, embarrassed relay. I told her she didn't need to apologize for asking honest questions about someone she'd never really met. The apology, if it belonged to anyone, belonged to the people who'd answered those questions dishonestly rather than simply introducing us properly in the first place. Emma, whose graduation had inadvertently become the backdrop for all of this, sent me a message a few months later that I've thought about more than almost anything else that happened that year. She was applying for her first job out of college, she told me, and had been quietly following Ledgerline's coverage since the gala, and wondered if I'd be willing to look over her resume.
I did.
I also, eventually, offered her an internship on our operations team, not out of any obligation to the family drama that had swirled around her graduation, but because her resume was genuinely strong, and I liked the questions she asked in our first conversation, sharper, more curious questions than my own brother had ever thought to ask me in 6 years. I still think, sometimes, about that moment backstage, checking my phone after the panel, feeling the strange vertigo of 11 missed calls arriving all at once from people who'd spent years content not to call at all. I don't think the recognition changed who I was. I was exactly the same founder, the same person, on the drive to that gala as I was in the years before anyone knew my company's name. What changed was simply the evidence available to people who'd never bothered to look for it directly. I attended Christmas that year, and every family gathering since, and I've noticed something small but real. Nobody asks anymore whether my car is running okay, or comments on what I'm wearing, or wonders aloud, even gently, why I don't seem more put together. I don't know if that's growth or just embarrassment finally catching up to good manners. Either way, I've stopped needing it to be one or the other. I know what I built, and I know what it cost me to build it quietly without an audience, for 6 years before anyone thought to ask. Dr. Whitfield sent me a LinkedIn message a few weeks after the gala, mentioning, with what I suspect was some private amusement, that he hoped he hadn't caused any family drama by mentioning my name at the graduation. I told him, honestly, that he'd done me a favor, that some truths, apparently, only land when they arrive sideways, uninvited, at exactly the moment someone was trying hardest not to think about you at all. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Dr. Whitfield hadn't glanced at his phone at exactly that moment, if the coincidence of 2 events sharing an afternoon had simply passed without anyone noticing. I'd like to believe the truth would have surfaced eventually regardless, that 6 years of quiet accumulation can't stay hidden forever, that eventually the gap between what my family assumed and what was actually true would have closed on its own. But I'm honest enough with myself now to admit I'm not sure that's true. I think, left alone, I might have kept building in silence indefinitely, might have let another 6 years pass with my father quietly disappointed in a version of me that stopped existing long before he noticed. Some doors only open because someone else, entirely by accident, happens to knock on the right one at the right time.